morning. Welcome to Fellowship Church. We are so happy that you chose to start your morning with us. Wow, this has been a busy summer with lots of amazing events, and we aren't done yet. We have a fun event coming up this Saturday for FC Women. Join us for the Big Hat Brunch. It will take place in the LP Student Building from 9:30 to 11 a.m. We'll enjoy some good food, worship, and a brief message on the power of encouragement. I hope you will join us, even if you don't have a big hat. It's certainly not a requirement to attend. Sign up today online or in the atrium. One of our favorite days here at Fellowship is coming up, and you don't want to miss it. Sunday, September 7th, from 10:30 to 2:30 is our last blast. Mark your calendar. A fun-filled day that kicks off with an outdoor service, amazing baptisms as people go public with their faith, great food, water slide, games, bounce houses, giveaways, and so much more. We are so excited. This is the perfect opportunity for you to invite that person you keep meaning to invite to church. I know several of you that are here today because someone took the time to invite you to the last blast. Today when you leave, you will be given some invites. This is not just a reminder to you. It's so you can invite someone else as well. Be thinking about who you can ask this year and share those invites. In order for this day to be amazing, we need lots of volunteers. If you have volunteered in the past, you know how much fun it can be. Once you sign up, you'll be given a shift to work before, during, or after the event. No one has to work the entire time. There'll be plenty of time for you to have fun as well. This is a great way to try out serving and get to know other FCers in a fun environment. If you can help us out and serve at the last blast, please sign up in the atrium or online and we'll get in touch with you. I want to thank all of you who give regularly to Fellowship. Your giving allows us to make a difference in the lives of so many. If you would like to give today, you can do so on our app or website by scanning the QR code on the back of the chair in front of you, or by putting cash or check in the black boxes in the atrium. This summer has been a busy time for life change here at Fellowship, and many of you were part of it. We've had Live It Out Camp, LP Summer Camp, men's events, women's events. On July 19th, 23 FCers went to Costa Rica on a missions trip. It was an amazing, life-changing trip for everyone who went. Next week, we look forward to sharing with you a little more about what God is doing through Hope Partners in Costa Rica and how we were able to be part of that. But it was because of the generosity of so many of you that these events were able to happen. Many of you gave towards the missions trip to help alleviate the cost of the trip for those going. Many of you gave towards missions each month, and many of you gave towards the Live It Out Camp, which helped us to purchase the many supplies needed to make the week meaningful and unforgettable. Your giving is a direct part of the life change that happened. You are a part of the story of the events in Costa Rica, and you are a part of the story of life change in many of the children and students who attended camp. Thank you for that generosity. Enjoy the rest of the service.
In April 2007, 3 of my friends and colleagues were murdered for their faith. We were living in Malatya in the east of Turkey at the time, a city of about 500,000 people, and there was just one Turkish church. We were a congregation of no more than 20 Turkish-speaking Christians. Necati Aydın, Tilman Geske, and Uğur Yüksel were 3 of the leaders of our church. They were working at the office of a Christian publishing company during the day when 5 young Turkish men came to the office under the guise of wanting to learn more about Christianity. They were led into the office and served tea, and within a few minutes they attacked Tilman, Uğur, and Necati, tying them to their desk chairs and eventually slitting their throats with kitchen knives. Tilman and Necati were found dead at the scene. by the time they were discovered, and Uğur was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. I followed in a taxi and waited for news. Uğur didn't survive. Later, the investigation would discover that local and national government officials and some military personnel were involved in encouraging and assisting these 5 murderers. As you can imagine, it was shocking news for the church in Turkey. It was, of course, a personal tragedy for us, for our family, and in the days that followed, the believers in the Turkish church were faced with very serious questions. Questions about their own faith, and faced with the challenge of remaining faithful, knowing that the same thing might happen to them. The church survived, not only in Malatya, but in all of Turkey. The church even grew as a result of those murders. But many of the believers who were in Turkish churches in the country at the time abandoned their faith or stopped coming to church as they began to realize how serious, how genuine the danger was. That's the situation that the original audience of the book of Hebrews was faced with. We've been in a series following the stories of the characters in Hebrews chapter 11, and today I want to look at the last section of that chapter, Hebrews 11, from verse 32 to verse 40. Let me read those verses with you. Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 32. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle, and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had been planning something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. The book of Hebrews is written to primarily Jewish background believers in the Roman Empire. In the first century, the church had been growing in 2 distinct groups. There were Jewish background Christians who had already understood the concept of a Messiah and understood the idea of temple and covenant. And Jesus was understood by them to be the fulfillment of the covenant and the fulfillment of the promises, and to be the Messiah that's mentioned in the prophets. That Jewish background group of Christians was distinct from the Gentile, the non-Jewish background group of Christians that started to grow, especially with the ministry of Paul, who started to preach to non-Jewish peoples, Greek-speaking Roman citizens throughout the empire. And the church is growing in these 2 distinct ethnic groups. The Jewish background believers initially were able to stay in the synagogue as part of the Jewish community. It was a sect of Judaism to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. But eventually, there is a divergence. It's coming to a point where the synagogue is dividing from the church. The church has become something separate from the synagogue and has included now these Gentile Christians, which the synagogue just simply cannot accept. And so these Jewish background believers in Jesus have to make a decision. Will they remain in the synagogue, or will they remain in the church? There's a complicating factor. Not only is the synagogue separating from the church, but the Roman Empire has begun to persecute Christians. So now there is a cost to remaining in the church. And this, unfortunately, caused many of those first century Jewish background believers to think about and even abandon their faith, to return to just going back to being regular Jews, when being a part of the church is going to mean not only being isolated from the synagogue, from the Jewish community, but also enduring the persecution of the empire. It's a serious situation. It's real danger for these believers, and the author of Hebrews wants to encourage these Jewish background believers to remain in the church, to remain faithful to Jesus. He wants to remind them that Jesus is better. He wants to exhort them. He wants to warn them about the seriousness, the foolishness of walking away from Christ. And he wants to emphasize how Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that they hoped for as Jewish people. When we come to chapter 11, Hebrews 11 is a list of heroes of the faith. It's a famous chapter that outlines the stories of these heroes of the faith, as we've been hearing about in this series. The chapter begins with this, Hebrews 11, in the first 3 verses. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. The author is describing the value of faith. He highlights in this list the faith of these hearers because he wants the readers, he wants the audience, he wants you to have the same kind of faith. That raises the question for us. What is faith? There are lots of popular definitions or impressions about what faith is. I want to offer a definition of faith as belief plus trust. What is faith? Faith is belief plus trust. Faith isn't just a blind leap to believe something despite the evidence. That's not faith. Faith is believing what we know to be true about God and entrusting our lives to God. It's belief plus trust. That's what's being commended here in the examples that the author gives. We believe that God exists, but that isn't the whole picture of what faith is. We also trust him with our way of living. We trust that he's bringing all of history to its intended destination. We trust that he's using even our suffering for that goal. God is bringing about something good. It includes our suffering, and it is happening through our faith. The author there in those first verses of the chapter, he describes the way that the world comes about. It comes about from the invisible cause of God's power. And the world is moved by the power of faith that is in us and comes from God. And the world is moving toward a destination that is still in many ways invisible to us, and Christ is the evidence that it is real, that God really is doing something, that God really has fulfilled his promises and is bringing all of the world to a good place. We, in the New Testament, have the advantage of the example of Jesus, of being able to see the way that Jesus fulfills all of these Old Testament promises. And of course, the Old Testament people had to look forward to Christ in a way that we are able to look backward on Christ and see him and connect to God through Jesus. The message of the chapter here in those verses that we just read at the end of chapter 11, that the faith and endurance of those people who have gone before us is an example and an inspiration for us. It demonstrates the lesson that hardship, difficulty, even persecution, suffering, even the most extreme kind, it is shaping our souls if we are seeking God in faith. And that's what God is doing in the world. He's building a people who seek him in faith. That's different from thinking about the work of God in the world as trying to gather the greatest number of people who believe that God exists. That, I don't think, is what God is after in the world. He's not just trying to convince the greatest number of people that God exists. Rather, God is trying to build a people for himself who seek God in faith. He's built a universe in which seeking builds the muscles that are required for finding. It's in our seeking God in faith, moving toward God in faith, that we're able to connect to God in a way that makes our lives and even our suffering meaningful. Only this deep truth can make sense of the suffering and faithfulness of this list of heroes in Hebrews 11. Only this deep truth can make sense of the suffering and deaths of Nejati and Tilman and Ur. In those verses in Hebrews 11, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, the first characters that he mentions there in this section of the chapter, they're all judges during a period of Israel's ancient history, centuries before the author is writing here, when Israel was experiencing a period of lawlessness, of chaos. It was a time where there was very little order, and God raised up, empowered these judges who were regional rulers to bring some order to the land, and they all acted out in faith in important ways, even though they were all really flawed characters. The author here is implying a parallel between that previous time in Israel's history, the time of the judges, and now this first century context when the oppressive Roman Empire is persecuting Christians. And that's why it's tempting for these Jewish background believers to just go back to being regular Jews. But on this list of heroes, their faith led to courageous heroism and miraculous salvation. God does amazing, miraculous things through their faith. But notice a turn in verse 35. So verse 32 to 34, we have these miraculous things that happen as a result of the faith of these heroes. But notice what happens in verse 35. Right after he says, women received back their dead, raised to life again, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. That's part of the life of faith that the author of Hebrews wants to emphasize for us. It's part of a life of faith that we ought to emulate in these heroes. We should want to be like that. Not because we want to be tortured or sawed in two, but because we want to have the kind of faith that leads to perseverance, that leads to that kind of endurance. These are heroes not just because they did great victorious things, but also because their faith gave a kind of deep meaning to their lives so that they were willing to suffer. So that their suffering is part of their example of faith. Then the author says, the world was not worthy of them. And I think that's true of my friends. The world was not worthy of Tilman, Nejati, and Ur. May they be commended for their faith. May their examples inspire us. That's what the author goes on to say in the next passage. I want to take a look at that first few verses, the first 3 verses of Hebrews chapter 12. Andy introduced us to that section last week. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The author says, imagine this list of heroes of the faith, these victorious, miraculous heroes, but also these enduring, suffering heroes, many of whom have now died because of their faithfulness. Imagine them, the author says, as if they were an audience in a giant stadium. That's the image he's constructing here. We're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. It's an image about a stadium. If you've ever watched the Olympics, that's what he's picturing here. Imagine runners on the track in the bottom of the stadium there, looking around at the thousands of faces in the crowd. A full stadium. People standing and cheering. People encouraging and shouting. All of those spectators, a great cloud of witnesses. The author of Hebrews says, imagine those past heroes of the faith as our cloud of witnesses. They are there in our audience, not because they can literally watch us, but because their example is an inspiration for us. Imagine them as a cloud of witnesses, as a crowd in a stadium. And that example, knowing that they are there, that should inspire us, the author says, to throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Of course, in this era, first century Roman Empire, runners often ran literally with nothing entangling them, no clothes at all. Throw off anything that's going to trip you up and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. We don't run toward the crowd. We don't run even for the sake of the crowd. We run toward Jesus, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. He is the one who originates faith. He's the one who is empowering us by his Spirit to have the faith that enables us to run toward him. And that includes the joy set before him. He endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Let that be an example for you, the author says. Run. To run toward Jesus. To run knowing that there are examples of faithfulness in our past. To consider Jesus, who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Since those events in April 2007, I, of course, have been inspired to ask myself, and I want to present that question to you. Are you living in such a way that your life is meaningless if the gospel isn't true? Have you genuinely found in Christ the depth of meaning that makes life worth living, even despite the suffering that it includes? That is possible. That's possible in our life of faith when we connect to God through faith. The goal of the Christian life is not to get saved and go to heaven. It isn't to die and one day be rescued from this life. Rather, the goal of the Christian life is to be transformed, to become like Jesus by being connected to God through faith, even in suffering. And then, our suffering isn't meaningless. When we're connected to God in this way, we can experience the reality that Jesus is the source and the power and the destination of the history of the world and the direction of our lives. He is worth seeking. That message was intended to inspire and encourage first century believers who were tempted to abandon their faith. And it is also intended to encourage us to know that faith makes life and even suffering worth living. That Jesus is a destination worth seeking. And there are many ways in which the world we live in now is not terribly dissimilar to the first century circumstances of the Roman Empire or the era of the Judges. There are lots of ways in which it is different, and probably you aren't worried that you might die because you are a Christian. But you probably do have a series of temptations, pressures, inward and outward, that are drawing you, making you consider whether this life of faith is worth it. I'm hoping that the lives of the heroes mentioned in chapter 11 are an inspiration to you. And as I look out at the cloud of witnesses, I can see Tilman and Najati and Ur. And having heard their story today, I hope that you can see them there too, and that they're an inspiration for you to run.